capitalist processes. And I just wonder why you guys never talk about that. In other words, I understand that it's not what you're doing, but when in answer to Jodi Dean's, sort of call for a communist party, you say, here's all this cool stuff that we're doing, rather than pointing also to all the other wonderful things people are doing. And I guess I want to say that we're in a time where there are many anti-capitalist things going on, which are really important, and the Community Economies Collective is one piece of that. And that I think it's really important to sort of acknowledge that we're in a time of really important multiple social struggles.
A little bit on the things that preceded. I like the statement that the first speaker made about that one thing about communism as a currency is that people know it is what capitalism can't compromise. So that's one of the, I guess, the positive qualities of that term compared to various other kinds of struggles or opposition to capitalism. And I also think it's really interesting to see that right now, this conversation about the party, I mean, I've been to some Rethinking Marxisms before, I've been involved in various left politics. Nobody except in small groups talks about the party. So why do you think that conversation, and you also said it's defend the idea of the party by showing why it is necessary. So I guess I sort of agree with a lot of that statement. What do you think are some of the problems that are going to be encountered? I mean, why is the party, I guess the sort of history of the left, of the old movement, and what do you think are going to be the new challenges to this idea of the party? Right? Maybe it ties in a little bit with this question about class rule and the dictatorship of the proletariat, too.
Well, first on the party, I also really agree. You go to conference after conference of the left, and the person who brings up the party is the weirdo in the back, who's like the outcast. So I have to thank you from the bottom of my heart for making this a central question, because it is. And I think the point you made about how it is a vantage point from which to consider other questions. I mean, that is. Marx it's not that so much that Marx was a genius, but he was going to meetings of the First International once a week. He was getting a perspective of the entire world situation. There's no substitute for that. You can't just have a genius, come out of nowhere. And I felt like a couple of places you were bending the stick the other way. I feel like I don't just feel like, I know that they're, if you do want unity, you do have to reach out by recognizing the right of somebody who's oppressed in a different way than you are to do things on their own. But you do that in order to unite. So I'm for the right of oppressed nationalities to self-determination because I want to work with them, not because I think it is better for us to work separately. But I recognize that the history of my position is as the oppressor, and if I want to work with them, then that's the kind of calling. But so I don't think that is disagreeing with anything you were saying. But anyhow, on this thing of cooperatives, this is one of the first conquests of Marxism, was to show that cooperatives are snake oil. And to a large degree, the discussion of cooperatives today is even farther back from Proudhon, because Proudhon at least recognized the need for cooperatives to get some kind of finances. You talk about the cooperative sharing the surplus. Well, if you're a small business, a lot of your surplus goes to the banks that lend you money to make your business possible, as many of these workshops have demonstrated. And if you're in a cooperative, you're in competition with other workers, like any other small business owner. So if you work for Walmart, you immediately have solidarity with workers in China who also work for Walmart. If you run a small retail business, you're now in competition with those Chinese workers. So I think that this kind of thing needs to be strongly confronted.
Maybe we'll respond on the class rule. That, the one thing capitalism can't tolerate is the rule of workers. I think that is roughly right. I would probably think it makes sense today to think about that as I hate this academic. Well, it's more complicated than that, but I can't help but do that because I think that now the changes in work and the changes in class make it difficult to say it so specifically. But what I would, but I think it's important because I think it helps us recognize the way that in the United States the two ruling class parties have become so elite and so separated off even from a middle class, and that was born, in fact, with the betrayal of the working class. I would say definitely by Clinton, right? When you can't say you don't say worker anymore, you don't say working class, everything is middle class. So at the very latest, though, we could talk about more history and earlier sort of exclusions, but I think that the way that we've seen the mainstream parties develop is one that has been completely to confine any access to the actual halls of power to a more narrower group of people, right? To a narrow class. So I would agree with that. On the nobody talks about the party. The good thing, right? I think that folks recognize is that that's changing in the socialist press. There's been in the last couple of years really good articles of people talking about the party in the the recent volume from the Socialist Register has a great essay that I cited from Mimo Parkera about the party, and that stimulated some debate. So I think it's pretty exciting that folks are now trying to think about that more seriously. On the problems encountered in the previous panel I was on, the Socialist Register panel, Joan Sangster spoke so eloquently and beautifully about the challenges faced by the party in the 70s, and not just one party, but multiple little parties, whether these were the inability of the men to deal with feminism, whether it was racism, whether it was a kind of intractability and dogmatism. So I think they're real experiences that people on the left have had that have made them retreat from it. And I think that now we've got new possibilities for, okay, maybe we've learned and we can go back. On the problems, I think there are two primary problems right now: individualism and mistrust. And those two things will destroy any left potential for movement, party or not. And so I think that those are the things that we have to encounter, and that thinking in terms of a party pushes us in ways that thinking in terms of autonomous affinity groups coming together in coalition every once in a while when they feel like it doesn't require us to think about it.
Thanks. It does seem like at least some of the questions were addressed directly to me, and so I'll try and deal with those first and see if that inspires me to say anything else. So the question that the woman in the middle here asked was about sort of why Gibson Graham or the Community Economies Collective as a whole hasn't really addressed non-capitalism versus anti-capitalism. And I'm not sure if my talk did a good job of explaining this, but that's kind of what I was trying to use the term post-capitalism that was the work I was trying to do with the term post-capitalism. So for me, it's really that moment of recognition that we've been taught a certain kind of, a certain set of metrologies that allow us to make sense of our lives as economic subjects. And that really the function of revealing economic difference or of other possibilities is to create that sort of gap between the pedagogy that has sort of convinced us that capitalism is the only game in town, and that there are other possibilities that might emerge, right? So it's a politics that comes out of that recognition that these are things that we could create collectively. Forgive me, I've kind of lost my train of thought there. So for me, whatever it is that we would do, whether it's starting a worker cooperative or creating reading groups so that people can really begin to think about different ways of organizing and enacting non-capitalist futures, the proliferation of enterprises. All of these things need to be built, right? So that's that political practice. And I think, at least from the perspective of the Community Economies Collective, or certainly me, I'm kind of agnostic about whether or not the party would be a context in which to do that. But what I do know is that an effective communist party of the sort that Jodi was describing would take an awful lot of work. It would have to be assembled and cut from whole cloth. And then I think the interesting thing from my perspective would be, what would be the relationship between that kind of a party and a federation of worker cooperatives? So in this state, using the solidarity economy as a concept, there are multiple initiatives for organizing networks of cooperatives. So the Valley Alliance for Worker Cooperatives is one, the National Association of Cooperative Businesses is another, there's a state forum that's coming together. And again, there could be a relationship there between that and community credit unions that are all over the place, right? And those things could be politicized effectively, right? So the agent that would be doing that work, it could very well be a socialist party. I used to be a sectarian communist, and I did organizing work on this campus. It was a lonely job, and I'm not sure how effective I was. But I guess I want to say something else too. I'm thinking about Mao and the Fourth Red Army, and when they were fighting the anti-imperialist struggle against the Japanese, they engaged in what was called the long retreat into the countryside. And of course, as they went into the countryside, they created liberated zones, right? They smashed feudalism, got rid of the local landlords, executed them, or whatever it is that they did. And in that way, they built the party, the power of the party, and also the power of the Fourth Red Army. And then when they got through with that process, they beat the Japanese and then kicked Chiang Kai-shek out. So this is again, speaking not as a member of the CEC, but just as me, there's a kind of an analogy there for me between that and thinking about building these discrete community economy institutions where people learn to practice communism, learn what it is to really take the economy as an ethical object and not just as this thing that's done to them. I'm hoping that clarifies at least a little bit. I guess one other thing I would say is that the point was really these tools, this work, this approach to scholarship, this approach to activism is what we in the CEC have to offer, right? And that can be definitely consonant with the millions of people that are being organized into solidarity economies in Brazil, in Italy, in France, in Portugal, Spain, and elsewhere, right? So there's I apologize if this didn't come through in my talk, but there are many larger social movements that seem to be sympathetically resonant. And maybe they are just waiting to be organized into a mass communist party of sort of a Trotskyite persuasion. I mean, who knows?
Well, I want to say how grateful I am to those of you who put this thing on, because it's been just really an incredible experience. And in response to Jodi, I think, yeah, we need a party, and I want to be in it. And I think we're on our way to a party. I mean, I have this feeling being here that we're on our way to a party, and where a party starts is with a sense of solidarity about something that I really feel in this place. So, and also at the same time, I really appreciate the comment about anti-capitalism and non-capitalism, and I mean, there's just so much to try to pull in and appreciate. And when we get to the point where we know what our platform is, I think then we have a party, and we move to a party. But one of the things I think this conference has shown, and at this point I think it's great, is that there are a lot of different viewpoints here about what a party would look like. And they're not necessarily inconsistent, but there are some inconsistencies with some things and more things that need to be ironed out in terms of, fewer inconsistencies, because that's what you need with a real party, right? I mean, you're always going to have inconsistencies, and you hopefully don't try to eliminate them all, because you want to be liberal in the good sense of liberal, and I think there is a good sense of liberal that we need to take back. The idea of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, within a party as well as within a society. But I just want to thank you again. It's just great to be here.
So this question is maybe directed for Jodi. So I I thought it was interesting that you're describing a party that seems to be very general, as well as one that seems oddly to not use discipline. And I think that there's an incredibly persuasive article that Michael Hart published in 1994 in Social Text that he couched as a critique of Gramsci, so we can put that aside for a moment, in which he says, due to the shift from disciplinary societies to control societies, that discipline is no longer possible. And I think that resonates a lot with the early part of your presentation, in which you said, with the decline of mass society and atomization, that people no longer come together in collective formations. And I think the mechanism in which you produce is a general will. And so my question would be, how is the general will produced without discipline? Or what particular type of discipline were you thinking?
I really enjoyed both papers. Rather than review what it is I liked about them, I want to remind you of questions that weren't answered. One of the disadvantages of taking batches of questions is that it's easy for questions to get lost. So let me just ask you again to address what the feeling is about, from the perspective of non-capitalist economies, what is the role that you envisage for anti-capitalist struggle? Is it someone else's work, which is fine? Do you think it's not necessary, which is a different answer? So I'd like to redraw your attention to that. And the other question I'd like to bring back up is, again, about cooperatives in particular. What is your vision of the idea that was broached by someone over there that it's wrong to be competing with Chinese workers for Walmart, let's say? I think that was the example given.
Part of my description was very much informed by Michael Hart's essay there, but where I would change is it's not. I don't think that now that discipline is no longer possible. I think that it's become something that it's as a general social mechanism. It's changed to control. But it's still possible if people will choose it, and so that it's something that can happen in different locations. It's just not a general social dynamic. I think that one thing about a party form that is important is it's the way party members discipline one another in order to build their solidarity. And as we recognize that, okay, we do not have the numbers to do 75 different projects all the time, but need to have projects that fulfill, that are connected with one another strategically in light of basically in light of a general plan for changing the fundamental structures of power under which we're living. So I would say that the only way that we can generate political will is through discipline. Or wait, can I add? Or if not, right, then the general environment is the one that is just kind of left to the locus of capitalism in the state, right? We're just caught up in the kind of flows and in the controls that we're under via state and market. So I actually think that we need the diagnosis of control society on Michael Hart, but what we can't say is that means that the left is only doomed to flow around within it or get smashed. But in fact, no, we can counter this, we can organize, and we can make hard choices, and we learn to act again collectively. And the thing is that I don't think that this means that, and this is what you said, like that would cut, it's got to be cut from the whole cloth. No, not at all. There are folks who have been committed militants in parties that we all know and have been around for a long time, and they, sometimes it's annoying, but they still have real skills. And part of, I think, that the things that need to happen is to basically stop the sectarianism and the holding on to splits that mattered 80 years ago, and to say, wait a minute, no, we've got, there's skills that folks have that we need. No, they can't be squandered anymore. We have to pull together, and so it's not whole cloth, and it's not. So it's using the parties the small, sectarian parties that we have. It's using the activist groups that we have as kind of branches of these things, and it's recognizing that it's not whole cloth. It's pulling together the things that we have so that our strength is more visible to one another.
Okay, so I'm also, once again, going to try and answer that question about the relationship between non-capitalism and anti-capitalism. And what comes to mind for me is the work that I've been doing with my friend and colleague Boone Shear with the Worcester Solidarity and Green Economy Alliance. We've taken a page out of the book, from the playbook from Brazil, where the solidarity economy is really founded around three things: social inclusion, cooperative development, and sort of strategic interaction with the local and municipal state. Right? So that's sort of the three parts of the social movement. And so at least in that version of building community economies, there's a relationship between people who are interested in organizing cooperative forms of production and those who are dealing with the effects of the repressive state apparatus. Right? So in the context of a city like Worcester, that would be aggressive minority policing, a city that's very small, but where you can really see the disparities between South Main and Shrewsbury Street, right? That there are, definite condensed materialities of power that we need to deal with, right? And at least from my perspective, one of the ways to do that would be to build economic and organizational power, right? Worcester, like a lot of cities in the Midwest that I've been in, is full of empty factories and open spaces that could be used as a basis for cooperative development. And again, for me, the point would be not just to have cooperatives, but to use them to exercise political power at a local level. And of course, that strategy can be replicated. And again, I think one form that effort could take, I suppose, would be the organization of a communist party where all splits from the past are reconciled. Again, having lived in that environment, I would be interested to see how that conversation would unfold. It would be a hard one. And I have to say, when I was in Occupy in Australia, there were sectarians there who I think on some level wanted to speak on behalf of the we, and they didn't let the voice of the we emerge. And it was, for me, really painful to watch, because I felt like something beautiful was happening there. One of them was, there was an Aboriginal fellow who got up and said, look, we've been occupying space inside of the Capitol for the recognition of pan-Aboriginal rights for the last 30 years. And so there's all kinds of connections and alliances that need to be built. Likewise, at least from my perspective, when we're thinking about the development of nations and cooperation, what if that idea was taken to First Nations, right, both here and in Canada and in Australia? There's the possibility there of really intervening in how resources are developed in all those societies, since a lot of Native peoples in all three of those countries sit on top of the remaining reserves of oil, coal, and natural gas. Right? So there's something at stake there. And, but that would, of course, require an accounting for the violent history of communist parties as they interacted with indigenous peoples. And I guess, I don't know what would happen there. Let me see, worker cooperatives competing. Well, this is just the contradictions of the world that we live in. I don't know that there's any way around that. But I do know that a lot of times cooperatives can make a point of really supporting the communities in which they reside, and that the nature of that support could be expanded through practices of solidarity at the local level, the state level, or the international level. Right? You can have a federation of international cooperatives.
The lobby of
such a thing exists.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I guess I'd like clarification on what we're thinking about when we talk of parties. I mean, I've got this kind of ambivalent sense here, because one thing we certainly need is a sense, start with this, that there are a lot of stuff going on the ground in social justice areas. I mean, there are cooperatives, there are environmental groups, there are people working to try to do something about urban poverty. There's all kinds of peace issues, race, anti-racism, and so on and so forth. And what I've long argued is people are doing all these different things, but if or when it happens that you get a sense that we're all, in some sense, involved in the same movement. Now, I've thought of it more in terms of movement, or I've sometimes called it the counter project against globalized neoliberalism. That sense, I think, is tremendously powerful. I think it's one of the things that gave the communist parties, of the post, after World War I, and a sense that every country had, communist party, and even though you were just doing this little thing, you were part of something much larger that really wanted to change the world. Okay, so that's my sense of a movement. But then there's the question of a party in a democratic society where the point of a party is to engage the electoral process and win some elections and get some people either locally, initially maybe, maybe on the school board, maybe, in city council, maybe ultimately contending for political power. But that kind of party, and I do think you need something like that, But that's different from this other notion of party. If you're in the party, you're in a cell, your sort of main identity is tied up with that, And so if you're doing a cooperative or something, well, you're maybe doing that too, but you've also got to go to these party meetings and so on and so forth. That kind of the model of the Communist Party, Which way, what are you thinking about here? Is it something contending for political power electorally? I mean, you're going to run candidates and things like that. It's something more than a movement and so on. Anyway, that's my question.
Yeah.
Me? Is this on? Oh, okay. First, compliments to both of you for excellent presentations. So thank you very much for that. And then a question for both of you. Do you see a role for spirituality in communist movement or future communist society, and spirituality in any form you might think of? It doesn't have to be organized religion, but whatever might come to mind. If you question for both of you, if you have any thoughts on that.
It's definitely my best age. Hi, I'm a member of the Community Economies Collective, and I don't see any of the projects or the models that people who are doing research in that collective, I don't see it as being antithetical to anything like a party. So the sort of antagonism is something I don't understand. So if there was a party, I mean, I would like to go. But yeah, so I just wonder what is antithetical about researching, understanding, and reproducing other kinds of economic processes to what would be a party. Certainly there are communist parties in other countries. It's just having a party is not going to solve everything. So I guess I wonder, what is the antagonism there? Why does it seem so problematic?
In ways, there are certain ways in which my question is connected to the question that was just posed, and I'll frame it one question for each of the two panelists. The first is to Jodi. In as much as you constantly identify a kind of a very rampant individualism as the problem, you're framing the problem of creating a party and moving forward as a problem of consciousness. And if we start from a premise that that human consciousness changes through various kinds of practices, what practices do you see out there which could be part of that kind of a transformation, which takes us away from that kind of hyper-individualism, hyper-utilitarianism that has come to dominate us for the last 3 or 4 decades under neoliberalism, for instance. So what is the pathway to that transformation of consciousness which is required for the new Communist Party? At the other end, the question the other panelist would be to simply ask how strong do you see a community economy formation as kind of a pre-party formation process? Thanks.
Jodi, should this be the last set of questions, or?
Okay, so first, I actually am not imagining a democratic electoral party, but a militant international organization. And though that said, I also would not, I mean, if there were reasons in a particular locality to run a candidate, that seemed to be a good way to actually have practices that were going to help build cadre and pull people together and let them change their experiences. I wouldn't rule that out. But what I don't have in mind is a kind of, oh, we need another general mass party. I don't think that's exactly right. Though, I mean, I don't mean to be so wishy-washy on this. I also know that some folks are also trying to call for that, and my worry is that if it's just kind of called for, rather than built through the extending of and solidification of existing networks, that it continues to have a kind of artificial something done to us feel. So that's one of my hesitations about the kind of just build left party, as if this were something like done by 5 heads of NGOs or something. So I imagine a kind of more militant party, but I don't think of it as just the same as movement. It's within the movement, right? And it's a socialist, communist. Socialist and communist core that actually works out and works through a kind of platform and set of reasons and set of ideas that comes from active engagement in movements. I'm thinking a lot of Syriza, right? That seems like one of the best examples that we have right now. And I was in Greece last summer talking to different folks, and one of the things that they said that was really great was that Syriza had been working on forming itself for like 10 years, like it was around, but it was during the occupations of the squares that they basically stepped back, listened to the people, and had let their social connection, the social part of the movement grow without trying to just kind of politically steer it. And that was one of the ways that they became stronger. And that seemed to me to make a lot of sense and be very smart. On the role of spirituality, I think that's, for me, that's not something that politics should do. I don't mean that people who are spiritual can't be political. I think that that's great. But I don't think that, in my view, a political party shouldn't be one that's trying to instill a kind of spirituality in people. That kind of makes me very, very nervous. And on the practices, what practices can lead to the kind of transformation? That's a fantastic question. Weirdly, and this is a little counterintuitive, I actually think that in the doggone lane new media practices that are so individualizing and personalizing, they have a flip side. And the flip side is a kind of constant sense of connection with other people, even if it's mediated. But also a sense of that what other people are doing really matters. And so I think that that's one location where people have a kind of commitment to, it's too weak, but it's not like, folks are disconnected sitting in their offices doing their own thing, or sitting, looking for a job or something like this. It's that they're doing that also with this kind of level of minimal connection that I think can also be strengthened and exacerbated. And then, of course, the real active political practices that people undertake in movement and communities. Those would be the things that I think help. And if those are also involving people being a part of economic collectives, well then sure. I'm not against economic collectives as a practice. What my concern with, and the reason that I criticize Gibson Graham in the beginning of the Communist Horizon, is that it seems to me to be offered as an alternative to communism, an alternative to militant confrontation with the state, militant confrontation with capitalism that says, no, this has to stop. Instead, it's more in part of a retreat that's like, well, we can do things in our own small networks. In reading this, I kept thinking, if this were right, Detroit would not be the mess that it is. There would have been alternative practices that could have done something to make it more inspirational, but it's not. And one, since I'm going to take this as my last comment, I want to, Stephen made some interesting and good points, but he also said when he was talking with his students, the first generation students, that their situation, he knows that the economy is bad and precarity, and he says, I don't see this as changing. I do, right? I do think this can change, but I think it has to take organized politics.
Well, certainly, that's a great point, and I would agree with that, and I wouldn't be trying to do the kind of work that I'm doing if I felt like the situation was intractable and capitalism was the only game in town. One thing that I found interesting about your characterization of it was the Greek Communist Party that we were talking about, right? That you said that they stepped back and started listening. So for me, again, I guess what I was trying to reflect on in my talk was the role that methodological techniques or practices of really research, I suppose, play in building community movements. So for me, that was an instance of the role of the audit, right, of just listening as a basis for organizing. And I suspect that whatever form a political assembly, like a party would take, whether it was a violent revolution or some other kind of means for transformation, it would involve the use of these reflective technologies that then go on to produce a collective sensibility, right? To be communists, we have to practice communism. That's sort of what I was trying to emphasize in my talk. And the question about spirituality is an interesting one for me. Again, because I think, when I look at the role that audits and self-assessments and collective self-reflection play in social movements, there is a spiritual dimension to that. Like Alinskyite organizing, for instance, really draws on religious tropes when it's talking about building political power through one-to-ones. Right? So the fellow who ran Obama's ground game for the last 2 elections said that Alinskyite technology of the one-to-one was what won them the election. Right? But the point is, I think that technology of connection can be used to build all kinds of politics, whether it's party politics, or organizing cooperatives, or drawing them into relationship to one another, or building solidarity economies, or much else besides. But I suppose another thing is just sort of the not knowing that I talked about towards the beginning. I mean, for me, I have no idea what to do about the international oceans commons. I do know that fishing stocks are down something like 75%. The oceans are contaminated with plastics. So dealing with any one of those problems is going to be the responsibility of all of us collectively. And if we had effective socialist organizations or communist parties, those would be matters of concern that we'd have to deal with. And that would mean building connections with the experts who know them. And that means being able to talk to people regardless of their sort of disciplinary location or their position in the current society. Right? There would be a lot of work. And I guess that's why, on some level, I really think of it as a kind of process of constructing these connections across the social landscape in specific contexts. So that's a political practice that could take place in a variety of conditions. Let's see here. There was one more question, and I just can't even remember it right now. What's that? Oh yeah, the pre-party. Thank you for keeping track of that. All right, look, I can give 2 answers to that. One would be as me, and one would be as a member of the Community Economies Collective. I think it's safe to say that the Community Economies Collective is a group of scholars doing activist work. If there were parties out there, I'm sure we could join them and do the work in that context. As a member of SAGE, I think the easy answer would be we're having a conference on November 9th, 10th in Worcester at the Youth Center. And we'll see what kind of political organization we can build there. There is talk in the state of Massachusetts of building a statewide solidarity economy party, right? That's actually a project, and it would really involve building concerts, building relationships between the different cooperative sectors, between groups that are focused on social inclusion or, sort of how the repressive apparatus works in Boston or Worcester or other social locations. And yeah, I'd invite you to join. That would be just lovely.
What about the after party?
Oh.